She walked into the killer's house alone. She sat across from him by his fire. She drank his brandy and she smiled at his stories and she let him believe he had won. But what the man called Ezekiel Grimshaw did not know, what no man in that Montana valley yet knew, was that the quiet young woman from Boston had a gift older than the mountains themselves. And in her pocket, hidden beneath her shawl, was the single brass horn that would bring three armed brothers through his front door the moment she blew it. This is the story of how a mail-order bride named Cordelia Pennington walked into a snowstorm, a wilderness, and a house of three strangers, and walked out with a life she never thought she would have. Stay with me. The cold came first before she even saw the mountains. Cordelia Pennington pressed her gloved hand against the frosted glass of the stagecoach window and watched her own breath bloom into a small cloud that vanished against the pane. Outside, Montana territory stretched in every direction like a country made of gray wind and bone-white sky. October of 1883 had come down hard on the high plains, and the stage had been climbing for 2 full days into a wilderness that felt less like a place and more like a warning. She was 23 years old. She had never been west of the Hudson River before this journey, and in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, folded 7 times against her ribs, was a letter from a man named Silas Ashford, who had promised her a home. The driver called back through the hatch that Kalispell was 2 miles out. Cordelia tried to swallow and found her throat too dry. She reached up and touched the small cameo brooch pinned at her collar. It had been her mother's. The ivory had yellowed slightly over the years, but the face carved into it still held a gentle dignity that Cordelia had studied in every mirror since she was a child, trying to see what her mother might have looked like grown aged alive. Her mother had died when Cordelia was 10 years old, giving birth to a brother who had not survived his first hour. Her father had followed 2 years ago, coughing blood into a linen handkerchief until there was no more blood left to cough. The parsonage in Boston had been sold to pay the doctors. The furniture had gone to auction. And then grandmother Eleanor had taken her in, and for 10 good years, Cordelia had lived in a small house on Beacon Hill, learning her letters and her Bible and her grandmother's strange secret art. The knowing grandmother, Eleanor had called it. In the old Scots tongue and Darasilla, the second sight. It was not witchcraft, though the neighbors had whispered that word often enough behind their hands. It was simpler and older than that. It was the ability to feel a storm before it arrived, to read the air the way other women read recipes, to know in the deepest marrow of your bones when danger was coming down the mountain. Grandmother Eleanor had died last winter, and in the months that followed, Cordelia had discovered that her grandmother's knowing had not been enough to predict her own ending, nor the debts she had left behind, nor the uncle who had appeared at the door with a proposition that made Cordelia's skin crawl. Horace Blackwood, a widower twice over, 55 years old with a drinker's nose and hands that lingered too long on a young woman's shoulder. He would forgive the debts, Uncle Cornelius had said, if Cordelia agreed to be his wife. She had said no. She had said it 3 times, each time louder than the last. And then she had gone to the public reading room on Washington Street, and she had opened a newspaper called the Matrimonial News, and she had found an advertisement that changed her life. Strong woman needed, mountain homestead, hard life, fair man, S. Ashford, Montana territory. 4 months of letters, 7 of them to be exact, each one short and plain and honest. He did not write pretty sentences. He did not promise love. He wrote about the land and the animals and the weather and the kind of work a wife would be expected to do. He signed each letter simply Silas. And in the last one, folded now against her ribs, he had written, I cannot promise you will be happy here, but I can promise you will be respected. Come if you can, I will meet the stage. The driver called out again. Cordelia pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched Kalispell resolve itself out of the morning mist. A small cluster of wooden buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, a livery stable, a general store, and a rough plank platform that served as the stagecoach depot. The stage slowed. The driver shouted to the horses. The wheels crunched over frozen ruts. She had arrived. Cordelia smoothed her navy blue traveling dress with hands that would not quite stop shaking. She gathered her small carpet bag from the seat beside her. She took one breath, then another, then a third, the way her grandmother had taught her when fear came knocking. And then she stepped down onto the platform and looked up to meet the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry. There were three of them. For a full 5 seconds, Cordelia's mind refused to make sense of what her eyes were seeing. Three men stood in a loose half circle at the edge of the platform. All three of them were enormous. All three of them wore thick beards and heavy coats of oiled canvas and wool. All three of them carried rifles slung across their backs and pistols on their hips and knives at their belts. They looked less like men who had come to meet a bride and more like men who had come to wage a small war. The tallest one stepped forward. His eyes were the color of a winter storm somewhere between gray and blue, and they held hers without flinching. "Miss Pennington," he said. His voice was a deep, quiet thing, weighted with the authority of a man who did not speak often and meant every word when he did. "Yes," she said, and was proud that her own voice did not tremble. "I am Cordelia Pennington. I am Silas Ashford." He touched the brim of his hat but did not remove it. "These are my brothers, Callum in the middle, Declan on the end. Our ranch is 40 miles from here. We need to leave within the hour. There is a storm coming." Cordelia's eyes flickered to the other two men. Callum, the middle brother, had the same storm gray eyes and the same dark hair, but his beard was shorter and there was a restless danger in him that reminded her of a dog that had not quite been tamed. His hand rested easily on the butt of his pistol, even as he looked at her. Declan, the youngest, was leaner than his brothers, with hair that fell longer past his collar, and eyes that were gentler, though no less watchful. He was studying her face with a strange intensity, as though he were trying to read a language he half remembered from childhood. "Three brothers," she said, and heard her own voice come from a long distance away. "The letters did not mention that I would be living with three brothers." Silas's jaw tightened. "The ranch belongs to all three of us. It was left to us jointly by our father. But you would be marrying only me, Miss Pennington. That I swear to you on my father's grave." Before she could answer, something shifted in the air. Cordelia felt it the way she always felt these things, not as a thought, but as a pressure behind her eyes, a metallic taste at the back of her tongue, a low humming at the base of her skull. She turned her face up toward the sky. The clouds were moving wrong. They were gathering and dispersing in patterns that did not match the wind at ground level. And underneath the ordinary cold of a Montana October morning, she could feel something else, something deeper, something patient and enormous, and bearing down on this valley like a fist. "It is not snow that is coming," she heard herself say. All three brothers went very still. "It is something much larger than that," she said, "and it will be here tonight." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Callum's hand slid off his pistol, and Declan, the youngest, took one slow step forward, his gentle eyes gone wide. "How do you know that?" Declan asked softly. Cordelia did not answer. She could not, because the shape of his question and the hush in his voice when he asked it told her that he already knew the answer. "Before we go any further, friend, if this is your first time joining me around this particular fire, take a moment and subscribe. I tell stories of the American frontier every week. Stories of hard country and harder people of love, earned through labor and loss of the men and women who built this nation with their own bare hands. And while you are there, leave me a comment. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. I always wonder about the homes where these stories travel. Now, let us ride on." The wagon ride to Silverthorne Ranch took almost 7 hours. Silas drove the team of 4 thick-bodied draft horses. Callum rode Point, a Winchester rifle laid across his saddle, his eyes sweeping the tree lines on either side of the rough wagon road. Declan rode rear guard, silent as a shadow, turning his horse every few minutes to check their back trail. Cordelia sat on the narrow bench beside Silas, wrapped in a grizzly bear hide that he had laid across her shoulders without comment when he noticed her shivering. The road climbed through a forest of Douglas fir and Engelmann spruce, so old and so tall that the light beneath them turned green and cathedral cold. They crossed 3 creeks, each one running black with the stain of pine needles and the last of the autumn leaves. They passed through a meadow where a herd of elk lifted their heads to watch them pass, steam rising from the animals' flanks in the chill air. Silas did not speak for the first 2 hours. When he did speak, it was to point with his chin at a distant ridge and say, "That is the edge of our land. From that ridge north to the next ridge, you can see past those trees and east to the creek and west up into the mountains. 3,000 acres near enough." Cordelia tried to take in the scale of it and failed. 3,000 acres was larger than the entire town of Boston, where she had lived her whole life. She could not imagine owning that much earth. They stopped at a place where a small creek crossed the road, and Silas swung down from the wagon to water the horses. He walked to the creek bank and cupped his hands and drank, and then he filled a tin ladle and brought it back to the wagon and held it up to her. "Drink," he said. "It comes from snowmelt off the Whitefish Peaks. You will never taste water better than this." She drank. He was right. Callum came riding up with a dead rabbit slung across his saddlebow, shot cleanly through the neck. He grinned at her expression. "Here we eat what we kill, ma'am," he said. "You will learn." "I am not afraid of a dead rabbit, Mr. Ashford," she said. He studied her, then, and for the first time the restless danger in him quieted just a little, and something like curiosity took its place. "Callum," he said, "Mr. Ashford is my brother up there, and I suspect we are going to have enough trouble telling us apart without you making it worse." Declan came up on her other side while Silas watered the horses. He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out something small carved out of pale bone-colored wood. He held it out to her in the palm of his hand. It was a deer, perhaps 2 inches long. Every line of it was exact: the arch of the neck, the lift of the head, the delicate curve of the ears. Cordelia had seen carvings in the finest shops on Tremont Street that were not half so fine. "You made this?" she asked. Declan nodded. He did not speak, but he tipped his hand slightly, and the small carved deer slid down into her palm. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Because my mother said that when the storm singer came, we were to give her a gift of welcome. I have been carrying that in my pocket for 3 weeks." Cordelia closed her fingers around the deer. She did not know what to say. She did not know if she was being welcomed or warned. She thought for just a moment that she heard her grandmother's voice say, "You have found the door, child. Now you must find the courage to walk through it." They reached Silverthorne Ranch as the sun was sliding down behind the western peaks. The main house was a 2-story structure of massive squared timber, built by Jeremiah Ashford with his own hands in the year 1862, back when this valley had been nothing but wind and wolves. The roof was laid with slate hauled in by ox cart from a quarry 300 miles away. The chimney was riverstone cemented with mortar made from lime that Jeremiah had burned himself in a pit behind the barn. The house sat on a slight rise with a view down across the valley to a silver creek that gave the ranch its name, and behind it rose the great forested flanks of the Whitefish Range, dark now with the approaching dusk. There were outbuildings scattered around the main house: a horse barn, a cattle barn twice that size, a smokehouse, a spring house, a tack room, a small bunkhouse where the hired hand slept, a chicken coop, and standing a little apart from the rest, a split-rail corral where 5 or 6 horses moved restlessly in the dying light. Cordelia counted 800 head of cattle on the near pastures alone. She could not see how much farther the herds extended. A woman came out of the main house as the wagon pulled into the yard. She was perhaps 60 years old, with iron-gray hair pulled back into a severe knot, and a broad, strong body wrapped in a woolen dress and a flour-dusted apron. Her eyes were the bright, pale blue of an alpine lake, and they filled with tears the moment she saw Cordelia. "Gott sei Dank," she whispered. "Gott sei Dank. At last a woman in this house." And before Cordelia could do more than smile, the old woman had wrapped her in arms strong enough to lift a bushel of potatoes and was weeping openly into her hair. "Miss Pennington," Silas said with something like amusement in his voice for the first time since the platform at Kalispell. "This is Mrs. Agnes Kessler. She keeps this house. She has kept it for 18 years. Do not let her small kindness fool you. She rules us all." "She rules you," said Callum, swinging down from his horse. "She spoils Declan, and she tolerates me." "She feeds you," Mrs. Kessler said sharply, releasing Cordelia and dabbing at her eyes with a corner of her apron. "Which is more than you deserve, young man. Now everyone inside. The stew has been on the fire for 6 hours, and if we do not eat it tonight, the meat will collapse into the broth. Come in. Miss Pennington, please, you must be frozen through." She bustled Cordelia up the wide plank steps and into the front room of the house, and the smell hit Cordelia first before any of her other senses could catch up. Wood smoke, leather oil, beeswax, bread, and underneath it all, the rich, savory darkness of beef simmered all day with carrots and onions and some herbs she could not quite place. The front room was larger than any room Cordelia had ever stood in. A stone fireplace dominated one wall tall enough for a grown man to stand inside it. A long trestle table ran down the center of the room, flanked by benches and two high-backed chairs at the head and foot. A spinning wheel stood quiet in one corner, draped with a half-finished length of wool. Shelves along the walls held tin plates, iron pots, a row of leather-bound books, and a long rifle that Cordelia suspected had been her husband's father's. Her husband's. She had thought the word without meaning to. She was not anyone's wife yet. She had not even spoken to Silas Ashford for a full hour. Mrs. Kessler propelled her toward the fire. Mrs. Kessler took her coat. Mrs. Kessler pressed a cup of hot black coffee into her hands and insisted she drink it before she spoke another word. And by the time Cordelia was seated at the long table with a bowl of the richest beef stew she had ever tasted, steaming in front of her, she had begun to feel something she had not expected to feel so soon. She had begun to feel less afraid. The three brothers sat down around her. Silas took the head of the table. Callum sat to his right, Declan to his left. Cordelia sat at Silas's right hand across from Callum. Mrs. Kessler sat down at the foot of the table and said a short grace in German, and then bread was passed and butter and a small jar of pickled beets, and the eating began. Callum did most of the talking at first. He was the kind of man who filled silences because silences made him restless. He told her about the valley. He told her about the coming winter, which was expected to be harder than any in a decade. He told her about the hired hands in the herd and the wolves that had been moving down out of the high country earlier than usual this year. Cordelia listened and tried to remember every name and every warning. But beneath the flow of Callum's words, she could feel the silence of Silas Ashford beside her. He ate slowly, methodically, the way a man eats who has known hunger. He did not look at her directly, but every few minutes his eyes would flick sideways and then away again, and she understood that he was measuring her, deciding, trying to reconcile the woman who had arrived with whatever woman he had been imagining for 4 months of winter letters. Declan did not speak at all. He ate what was set before him and watched her hands when she reached for bread and watched her face when she laughed at something Callum said and watched the small carved deer that she had placed on the table beside her bowl because she had not wanted to put it away yet. Finally, about halfway through the meal, Silas set down his spoon and cleared his throat. "Miss Pennington," he said, "I think it is right that I tell you plainly about this family, about who you have come to." "Please," she said. "Our father was Jeremiah Ashford," he said. "He came to this country from Pennsylvania in the year 1847, when I was not yet 2 years old. He and my mother, Margaret O'Brien, in the clothes on their backs. My mother was Scottish-Irish on her father's side. Jeremiah was English-Welsh as far back as anyone knew. They built the first cabin on this land with their own hands. It stood where the smokehouse stands now." Silas paused. He looked at the fire. "My mother died of the smallpox in 1855 when I was 10 years old. She took the baby with her, a sister who never had a name. His voice did not change, but his hands resting on the table curled slowly into fists and then slowly open again. My father was not a warm man after that. He worked, he drank, he did not speak much. 2 years later, in 1857, he went to a barn raising in a settlement 2 days east of here, and he met a young woman who had come off an immigrant ship at Boston Harbor not 6 months before. Her name was Roisin Fitzgerald. She had come from County Cork after the Great Hunger. She was 20 years old. My father was 36, and he married her within a month of meeting her. Cordelia looked up sharply. She understood suddenly where this was going. "Roisin was my mother," said Declan quietly. It was the first full sentence he had spoken at the table. "She was a kind woman," Silas continued. "She raised Callum and me as her own, and she bore my father one son, Declan, in 1858. She was also Miss Pennington, a woman very like your grandmother. She had the Irish second sight. She would wake in the night and go out into the fields barefoot because she said the wind was calling her. She sang in the Gaelic tongue when she was alone. The people of Kalispell called her the Irish Witch. They made Declan's life very hard when he was a child." "They still do," Callum muttered. "Ignorant bastards." "Our father died 5 years ago," Silas said. "The official word was that he was thrown from his horse. He is buried on the rise behind the house next to my mother and next to Roisin, who went before him in 1868 of a fever. The ranch was left jointly to his 3 sons on the condition that the eldest marry and produce an heir within a reasonable span of years. My father was not a man who accepted the line ending." He looked at Cordelia, then fully for the first time across that long plank table. "I did not write to you because I wish to love you, Miss Pennington. I wrote to you because I am a man who keeps his word, and I gave my word to my father as he was dying. I told you that in my letters plainly. I am telling you again now in front of my family so that there is no mistake between us." Callum set his spoon down with a small, sharp click. "And I will tell you plainly, too, ma'am," he said. "I did not approve of this. I still do not. A city woman out here in a country like this, in a winter, like the one coming with a man like my brother who sleeps in his boots and reads the Bible like it is a ledger. You will break inside 2 weeks. And when you break, you will take our brother down with you, and I will not forgive you for that." A hush fell over the table. Mrs. Kessler's hand went to her throat. Declan closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words physically hurt him. Cordelia Pennington set down her spoon. She felt her grandmother's steady hand on her shoulder across all the miles and all the years. She heard her father's voice from some long-ago Sunday pulpit. She remembered the stagecoach ride and the letters in Horace Blackwood's damp fingers and every step she had taken to arrive at this moment. She lifted her chin. "Mr. Ashford," she said, looking straight at Callum, "I traveled 2,000 miles to sit at this table. I buried my mother when I was 10 years old. I nursed my father through 16 months of dying. I watched my grandmother, the only woman who ever taught me anything worth knowing, slip out of this world while I held her hand. I have been cold before and hungry before and afraid before, and I did not break. I am not a city woman, I am a Pennington, and the Penningtons, sir, do not run." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Silas Ashford, at the head of the long table, said very softly, "Good." And Callum, after a moment, picked up his spoon again and went back to his stew, though there was something in the set of his shoulders that was no longer quite so hostile. Declan looked at her across the candle flames. His eyes were wet. He did not say a word, but his hand moved, and beneath the table, for the briefest of instants, his fingers brushed her wrist in something that felt remarkably like gratitude. After supper, Mrs. Kessler led her upstairs to a small, clean bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed was narrow, but piled high with wool blankets and a quilt that Mrs. Kessler said had been stitched by her own mother in Bavaria 40 years ago. There was a wash basin on a stand and a pitcher of water that Mrs. Kessler promised would be hot by morning, and a single candle in a pewter holder on a small writing desk by the window. "You will be safe here," Mrs. Kessler said, pausing at the door. "The door has a bolt. The men of this house do not enter a woman's room uninvited. That is a rule of Jeremiah Ashford that his sons still keep. Sleep now, Liebchen. You are very tired." Cordelia slept, but she did not sleep well. Somewhere in the deepest part of the night, perhaps 3 in the morning, perhaps 4, she came bolt upright in the narrow bed with her heart pounding against her ribs. The pressure was back behind her eyes, and this time it was not a whisper. This time it was a scream. She knew with the absolute certainty her grandmother had taught her to trust above all other things that a storm was breaking over the Whitefish Valley. Not the ordinary snow the brothers had spoken of, something much worse. An ice storm driving down from Canada on a hard, fast wind, and it would be on them within the hour, and if the cattle were out in the northern pastures when it struck, they would stampede blind into the canyons and die by the hundreds. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. She pulled on her dress over her nightgown. She caught up the heavy shawl Mrs. Kessler had draped over the foot of the bed, and she went down the stairs barefoot, her heart hammering, her breath coming short. She did not hesitate at Silas Ashford's bedroom door. She knocked once, and then she pushed it open. He was sitting up, already a pistol in his hand, the covers thrown back. He must have heard her on the stairs. In the faint light from the hall candle, his eyes were hard and quick, and his chest was bare where his nightshirt had come unlaced. And for just one heartbeat, Cordelia forgot why she had come. Then she remembered. "The storm," she said. "It is coming now, not tomorrow, now. If the cattle are in the north pasture, they must be moved. They must be moved to that box canyon Callum spoke of at supper, the one with the stone walls. It will be on us within the hour, Mr. Ashford. I am begging you to believe me." He looked at her, just looked at her. His eyes moved from her bare feet to her loose hair, to her face, and he did not say anything for what felt to her like a small eternity. Then there was a soft scuff of leather behind her in the hall, and she turned to find Declan standing there in his shirt sleeves, his face pale. "Silas," Declan said, "believe her. My mother told me what to look for. This woman has it. She has it the way my mother had it. Please, brother, believe her." Silas Ashford moved. He was out of the bed in one motion. He was pulling on his trousers, his boots, his heavy coat. He was shouting down the hall for Callum, and his voice carried through the house like a rifle shot, and Cordelia heard a crash from the far bedroom as Callum came up out of sleep, swinging. "Every hand saddled and mounted in 10 minutes, Silas was shouting. "North pasture, we move the herd to Ghost Canyon. Now, go!" Within 15 minutes, Cordelia Pennington was on horseback in the frozen dark. She had never ridden at a gallop in her life before that night, but a small, strong buckskin mare named Juniper had been thrust into her hands by Declan with a murmured promise that the mare knew the country, even if her rider did not, and Cordelia had swung up into the saddle with her heart in her mouth and her grandmother's voice in her head, and had followed the brothers out into the howling dark. 8 hired hands came with them. Silas rode point, Callum rode flank. Declan stayed close to Cordelia's left, a long rifle across his saddle, and a lantern held high in one gloved hand. The lantern light swung in wild arcs across the churning ground as they rode, and it showed her flashes of things as they passed. Frozen grass, the eye of a startled jackrabbit, a split rail fence, a stand of birch trees the color of bone. The wind was rising. She could feel it now, ordinary to ordinary senses. It was no longer coming from the west the way the evening wind had come. It was coming from the north, hard and cold and steady, and it carried the first faint sting of ice. They reached the northern pasture in 40 minutes. 800 head of cattle stood bunched against the far fence, restless, lowing, aware that something was wrong. Silas did not waste words. He split the hands into 3 groups. He sent 2 men north to open the drift gate. He sent 3 men west to push the herd toward that opening. He sent the rest of them, including Cordelia, to the east flank to prevent any animal from breaking away and running wild onto the open range. For 2 hours in the cold and the dark and the rising wind, Cordelia Pennington worked cattle. She did not know how to work cattle, but the little buckskin mare knew, and Cordelia gave Juniper her head and clung to the saddle horn with her knees burning and her lungs on fire. And she shouted the way the hands shouted, and she waved her shawl the way Declan waved his lantern, and slowly, the herd began to move. The first flakes of ice came down at about 5 in the morning. They were not gentle. They were hard pellets driven sideways on a wind that had climbed past 50 miles an hour, and they stung bare skin like buckshot. Within minutes, the grass was glazed. Within a quarter of an hour, the horses' hooves were skidding. The cattle spooked, and freezing began to surge faster. Twice a steer broke from the flank and tried to run for open country, and twice Callum rode it down and turned it back with a swing of his rifle butt and a voice like a cracking whip. They got the last of the herd into Ghost Canyon just as the full weight of the storm came down. Cordelia saw it arrive. She was holding her position at the canyon mouth, keeping Juniper steady against the rising gale, and she looked up and saw a wall of blue-black cloud move across the face of the dawn stars and swallow them whole. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in the span of 5 minutes. The ice pellets became solid ice, half-frozen rain that sheeted sideways through the air and glazed every surface it touched within seconds. A great cottonwood tree at the edge of the canyon split with a sound like a cannon shot and fell slowly, almost gracefully across the trail. Callum came riding up beside her. His beard was white with ice. His eyes were wild. "In," he shouted. "In, and last one in, go." She turned Juniper and rode the mare into the shelter of the canyon walls, and the wind broke against those walls and parted, and on the leeward side there was a sudden eerie quiet, and she realized she was weeping and had been weeping for some time without knowing it. One of the hired hands, a boy named Jesse Morgan, who could not have been more than 18, had nearly frozen in the last push. They pulled him from his saddle, blue lipped and shuddering, and Cordelia, who had learned a little field medicine from her father in his long dying, ordered him stripped of his wet outer coat and wrapped in 3 dry blankets from the supply packs. And she sat with him in the lee of a rock wall and chafed his hands and his feet for an hour while the storm raged above them and she got warmth back into him. He would live. He would still have all his fingers in the morning. He would 10 years later name his first daughter Cordelia. When the worst of it had passed, near sunrise, Silas Ashford found her sitting with her back against a boulder, Jesse Morgan's head on her lap, her own face streaked with ice and tears and exhaustion. He knelt down in front of her without a word and took off his own heavy bearskin coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Miss Pennington," he said. His voice was hoarse from shouting in the storm. "I owe you an apology." She tried to say something and could not. "I did not fully believe you," he said. "When you spoke at the supper table, when you spoke in the wagon, I believe perhaps half of you. I am telling you now in front of the God in these mountains that I was wrong. You saved this ranch tonight. You saved these men. Every head of cattle we own would have been dead in the canyons by noon if not for you. I will not forget this." She found her voice just barely. "It is your ranch, Mr. Ashford." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something that stopped her breath entirely. "If you stay, Miss Pennington," he said, "it will be your ranch too." They stayed in the canyon through the full day as the storm blew itself out. By nightfall, the hired hands had built a low fire in the lee of the stone wall, and coffee was boiling, and a hastily slaughtered young steer was roasting on an iron spit, and the cattle were settling to rest in the deep grass at the canyon floor, safe from the wind. Cordelia sat by the fire wrapped in Silas Ashford's coat, which smelled of pipe smoke and leather, and a clean male musk that she had never smelled on a man before. Her hands would not stop trembling, but she told herself it was only the cold. Declan sat down beside her at the fire. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, laced with something that burned her throat, going down. "My mother was right about you," he said quietly. "Your mother has been dead 15 years, Mr. Ashford." "My mother," he said, "still speaks to me in dreams. And 3 weeks ago, she told me that a storm singer was coming down out of the east, and that when she arrived, I was to carve a deer from aspen wood and put it in her hand, and that she would save this family. She said all of that, Miss Pennington, 3 weeks ago, before your last letter even reached us." He paused. He looked into the fire. "I thought she was only a dream. I see now that she was not. Cordelia had no answer for that. She drank her coffee and watched the flames. What neither she nor Declan knew, and what no one at that canyon fire could have known, was that 8 miles to the southeast on a high bluff overlooking the Silverthorne Valley, a man on a tall black horse had been watching the Ashford herd through a Brassfield telescope for most of the morning. He had seen the cattle driven into Ghost Canyon just ahead of the storm. He had seen the slim figure of a woman in a shawl riding the east flank, and he had lowered his glass and smiled a slow, cold smile that no one on earth would have wanted to see turned in their direction. His name was Ezekiel Grimshaw. He owned the Black Pine Cattle Company. He had murdered Jeremiah Ashford in the spring of 1878 and made it look like a throne rider. And as he turned his black horse back toward his own ranch in the gathering dusk, he was already beginning to consider the interesting new question of exactly who that woman was, and why the Ashford cattle had been moved hours before the storm broke, and what a man of his resources might do about both. 3 days later, after the ice had melted and the hands had driven the herd back to the home pastures, Silas Ashford asked Cordelia Pennington to sit with him in the front room of the main house. A fire burned low in the great stone hearth. The afternoon light came golden through the west-facing windows. Mrs. Kessler had discreetly taken herself off to the kitchen. Callum was out mending fences. Declan was in the barn tending to a horse that had cut its leg on ice. Silas sat across from her in one of the high-backed chairs. He had shaved since the storm. He looked younger than she had thought him at first. Perhaps 38 no more. "Miss Pennington," he said, "I am going to say plainly what I think should be said, and then I will ask you to say plainly what you think. Is that agreeable?" "Yes, Mr. Ashford. I wrote to you out of duty," he said. "I have told you that already, and I will not hide behind pretty words now. I did not write to you to fall in love. I wrote to you to keep my word to my father." "I understand that." "You arrived here 4 days ago," he said. "In those 4 days you have taken one look at my ranch and known what the weather was going to do to it. You have ridden through an ice storm that would have killed most men I know. You have faced my brother Callum across my father's table and refused to be bullied. You have earned the respect of Mrs. Kessler, which is not a small thing. You have been called a storm singer by my brother Declan, which is the closest thing to a blessing he gives to any living soul. And you have done all of this while being, by your own words, a woman from Boston who had never seen a mountain before last Thursday." He paused. He looked at the fire. "I am not a man who rushes," he said. "I did not rush my father into his grave, and I will not rush a woman into a marriage. So I am going to make you an offer, Miss Pennington, and I want you to consider it carefully." "I am listening." "Stay here for 6 months," he said, "until spring. We live under this roof together, but not as husband and wife, not yet. You sleep in your own room. You work on this ranch as a partner, not a servant, and you take your share in the decisions that are made here. I will pay you $50 every month for your labor, which is more than any hand on this place is paid. At the end of the 6 months, if you wish to go home to Boston, I will buy your ticket, give you the 6 months' wages in gold, and make no claim on you of any kind. If you wish to stay, we will marry properly before God and a minister, and this will be your home for the rest of your life, and every acre of Silverthorne Ranch will be as much yours as mine." He finally looked up from the fire. "What do you say, Miss Pennington?" Cordelia Pennington sat very still in her chair. She thought of Boston. She thought of Horace Blackwood. She thought of the parsonage that was no longer hers. She thought of her grandmother's voice saying, "A good man does not hurry, child. Good men build slow like mountains." She thought of the little carved deer in the pocket of her dress. She thought of Jesse Morgan coughing into the blankets alive because she had known. She thought of Silas Ashford kneeling in the dirt of Ghost Canyon at dawn, putting his own coat around her shoulders. She thought of her grandmother's last words spoken from the pillow of a dying bed in a narrow house on Beacon Hill. "You will find your home in the storm, child. When it comes, do not be afraid. Walk into it." "I say yes, Mr. Ashford." said Cordelia Pennington. And outside the west-facing windows of the main house at Silverthorne Ranch, the late October sun slid down behind the peaks of the Whitefish Range, and the first true snow of the season began very quietly to fall. She had agreed to 6 months. She did not yet know that in the 6 months before her, she would face the hardest winter Montana had seen in 30 years, a man who would try to burn the barns down around her, a secret about the death of Jeremiah Ashford that would shake this family to its roots in a love deeper than any she had permitted herself to imagine in all her 23 years of life. She did not know any of that, but her grandmother had known. Her grandmother had known for a long time. You will find your home in the storm, child. The old woman had been right. Winter had only just begun. The snow that began falling the evening Cordelia Pennington said yes did not stop for 4 days. It came down soft and slow at first, the way the first real snow of a Montana winter always comes, as if the sky itself were settling in for a long stay. By the second morning, the world beyond the windows of the main house had turned white and still and muffled. And Cordelia stood at the kitchen window with a cup of Mrs. Kessler's black coffee in her hands and watched Declan Ashford cross the yard toward the horse barn with a bucket of grain in each fist, and she understood in a way she had not quite understood before that she had crossed a line she could not uncross. There was no going back to Boston now. Even if she had wished to go, and she did not, the high passes would be closed within the week. She was here until spring. She was here at least until she and Silas Ashford decided what they were to become. The first thing Silas did on the morning after she gave her answer was teach her how to chop wood. He came for her after breakfast with a small hand axe and a pair of leather gloves too big for her hands. He walked her out to the wood pile behind the smokehouse where a great heap of split-quartered logs stood stacked against the wall, and beside it a chopping block and a larger axe and a scattering of unsplit rounds of fir and pine. A woman who lives on a mountain ranch, he said, chops her own kindling when the men are in the far pastures. It is not a question of pride, Miss Pennington. It is a question of warmth. A fire left to die because no one can split the wood to feed it is a fire that kills a family. Show me, she said. He showed her. He set a round of pine on the chopping block. He showed her how to grip the axe handle, right hand near the head, left hand near the butt. He showed her the motion, the way the right hand slid down to meet the left as the axe fell, so the weight of the axe did the work and not the strength of the arms. He swung once, and the round split cleanly into 2 half-moons that rocked on the cold ground. Then he handed her the axe. It took her 9 attempts to split her first round. By the 4th attempt, her palms were blistered through the gloves. By the 6th attempt, her shoulders were burning. By the 9th attempt, she was crying silently and refusing to let him see, and she brought the axe down with the whole weight of 4 days of fear and exhaustion and grief, and the round of pine parted beneath the blade with a sound like a gunshot. Silas, who had been leaning on the smokehouse wall with his arms folded, said only, "Good. Now do it again." She did it again. She did it 19 more times that morning until she could split a round in 3 strokes and sometimes in 2. When she finally set the axe down at noon, her hands were bleeding inside the gloves and her back would not straighten properly, and she wanted to lie down in the snow and weep. But she had a neat small pile of kindling at her feet, and Silas looked at it, and he looked at her, and he said, "You will do, Miss Pennington." That was all he said. It was enough. Callum taught her to shoot. He did it without being asked. He simply appeared in the front room 3 evenings after the wood-cutting lesson, a long rifle and a pistol laid across his arms like a sleeping child, and said, "Up, out, now. A woman on this ranch who cannot shoot is a danger to herself and to the rest of us." She followed him out past the barn to a place where a fallen cottonwood lay across a frozen creek. He set 6 tin cans on the log. He walked her back 20 paces. He handed her the long rifle first. "It kicks," he said. "Set the butt hard against your shoulder. Lean into it. Do not close your eyes when you pull the trigger. Do not flinch. The rifle does not care about you. The rifle is an iron thing. But if you respect it, it will feed you in a hard winter and it will keep you alive on a bad road. Her first 3 shots went wide. Her fourth shot clipped the edge of a can. Her fifth shot took the center can off the log and sent it spinning 12 feet into the snow. Callum whistled low between his teeth. Well, well, he said, there may be hope for you, city woman. Cordelia, she said, lowering the rifle. My name is Cordelia, Mr. Ashford. If I am to carry your brother's rifle, I believe I have earned the use of my name. He looked at her sideways. A slow, crooked smile moved across the lower half of his face, barely visible inside his dark beard. Cordelia, he said. All right, Cordelia it is. Declan taught her to ride. Not the way she had ridden the night of the ice storm, clinging to the buckskin mare Juniper in a kind of survival trance. He taught her properly. He taught her the posting trot, the sitting canter, the signals of knee and heel and rein that a well-made frontier horse would answer to. He taught her how to catch a horse in an open pasture, how to saddle one alone, how to doctor a small cut on a fetlock with pine tar and clean cloth. He did all of this in near silence. Declan Ashford was not a man who filled the air with words. But when he spoke in that low, soft voice of his instructions were so clear and so patient that Cordelia learned from him faster than she had learned anything from anyone in her life except her grandmother. On the 5th afternoon of their lessons, as she was brushing down Juniper in the cross ties of the horse barn, she looked up to find Declan watching her. You are a good teacher, she said. He shook his head slightly. I was a quiet boy. I watched my brothers learn from my father. I learned secondhand. It made me patient, I think. She kept brushing. The horse leaned into the brush and sighed. Declan, she said, will you tell me about your mother? He was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. But then he came into the stall beside her and picked up a curry comb and began working on Juniper's opposite flank. And his voice when it came was not the voice of a grown man, but of a boy who had lost something he had never stopped missing. Her name was Roisin Fitzgerald, he said. She was from a village called Skibbereen in the west of County Cork. She came to Boston on an immigrant ship in 1856 when she was 18 years old. The famine in Ireland had taken her mother and 3 of her brothers. She had a sister who died at sea on the passage. She had nothing and no one when she stepped off that ship. He worked the curry comb in slow, careful circles. She went into service in a house in Boston for a year. Then she came west, like so many of them did, looking for a husband who would not care that she was Catholic and Irish. She met my father at a barn raising in the Dakota Territory in the summer of 1857. He was a widower with 2 young sons. She was 20, he was 36. She told me once that she knew the moment she saw him across the hayfield that he was the man she had come to America to find. That is a beautiful thing to know. She had the second sight, Declan said quietly. She never called it by its English name. She called it Indarasilla. She said it ran in the women of her mother's line going back to before the Normans came to Ireland. She could smell a fever before it struck. She knew when a calf was going to be born backwards. She knew the day before they came to the door that there would be soldiers asking for my father about an old matter from before I was born. She knew these things the way you know them, Cordelia, the way my mother said the storm singers always know. She called me that when you carved the deer. She told me in a dream to carve it, he said. 3 weeks before your last letter came. She said a storm singer is coming down the long road out of the east, and when she arrives, you will know her, and you are to give her the deer carved of aspen wood, because the deer is the spirit of a woman who walks gently and sees far. I did as she told me. Cordelia's hands had stopped moving on the horse's back. Declan, she said, how did she die? Fever, he said. When I was 10, the winter of 1868, it swept through the valley that year. We lost 11 people. She was one of them. He paused. The curry comb moved in slow circles. The men in the town called her the Irish witch. They would not come to her funeral. My father buried her himself on the rise behind this house. I have stood at her grave every Sunday of my life since then. I am sorry, Cordelia said. Do not be sorry, he said. Be what she said you were. Be the storm singer. This family needs one. You do not know how badly this family needs one." She did not know yet, but she was beginning to understand. The first real conversation she had with Silas Ashford, the kind of conversation that moved two people from being strangers sharing a roof to something else, happened on a Tuesday night in early November, beside the stone fireplace of the main room. Mrs. Kessler had gone to bed early with a headache. Callum was out at the bunkhouse playing cards with the hands. Declan had ridden to the far winter pasture to check on a pregnant mare and would not be back until dawn. The house was quiet in a way it rarely was. The fire popped and settled. The wind outside was a steady, low voice against the window glass. Cordelia sat in the rocking chair by the hearth mending a pair of wool socks that belonged, she thought, to Callum, though she could not be sure because all three brothers were the same appalling size. Silas sat in the high-backed chair across from her, a pipe in his hand, a book open on his knee. The book was his father's Bible, worn soft along the spine, the margins thick with Jeremiah Ashford's cramped pencil notes. After perhaps an hour of this quiet, Silas closed the Bible. "Miss Pennington," he said, "you have been here almost a month, and I realize I have not asked you very much about your own people, about the grandmother who taught you." She looked up from the socks. The firelight lay warm on his face, and for the first time she noticed how young he looked when he was not holding himself ready for some disaster. 38, she thought, still young, still a man who might yet have a life. Her name was Eleanor McGregor, she said. She was born in a village in the Scottish Highlands in the year 1801. She came to America with her husband, my grandfather, in the year 1840. My grandfather was a Presbyterian minister. He served a small congregation in Boston until his death in 1868. My grandmother outlived him by 15 years. She was the one who taught you the knowing. She was the one, Cordelia said. In our family, it had always come to the women of her line. Her own grandmother had it. Her mother had it. Two of her aunts had it. It skipped her own mother and came to her, and she was told as a girl that she would pass it on to one of her grandchildren, and she did not know which one it would be until I was 7 years old and there was a tornado warning over Boston Harbor, and I came to her bedroom and told her that the air tasted wrong. What did she say? She said, "Now you are mine, child." And from that day until her last, she taught me everything she knew. Silas set the pipe down on the small table at his elbow. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely between them. The firelight caught in the gray strands scattered through his dark hair and in the pale lines at the corners of his storm-gray eyes. "My mother died when I was 10, he said. I think I told you that the first night. You did. I have not had a woman in my life who really knew me since she died, he said. 28 years ago, near enough. My father remarried and Roisin was kind and I cared for her, but she was not my mother. And after Roisin died and then my father died, there was only Mrs. Kessler in this house. And Mrs. Kessler is a blessing from God, but she is not a confidant. She is a bulwark. There is a difference. Cordelia said nothing. She sensed that he was speaking into a silence he had carried for a very long time, and that if she interrupted, the silence would close again. "I promised my father on his deathbed that I would keep this family together," he said, "that I would hold the ranch, that I would marry and sire a son and see that my mother's name and my brother's lives did not end with the three of us. I gave him my word. I have tried very hard in these 5 years to keep it. But Cordelia, I will tell you something I have told no living soul." He looked up then. His eyes met hers. "I did not know if I could do it. I did not know if I could find a woman, a good woman who could stand this country. And I did not know if, having found her, I could love her. I thought perhaps that part of me had died with my mother all those long years ago and had only pretended to be alive in the time since." She set the mending down in her lap. The socks could wait. "Silas," she said very softly. It was the first time she had said his Christian name aloud. His head came up at the sound of it. "A man keeps his word," she said. "That is what you are doing. That is what your father asked of you, and you have done it well. There is a woman in your house now by your own hand, and your brothers are safe, and this ranch will not end with you. Whatever else is or is not between us at the end of 6 months, you have kept your word." He looked at her for a long time across the space between the chairs. "A man keeps his word," he said, as if he were repeating a verse from Scripture. "I will try to remember that you said that to me." That was the night the phrase entered the house. "A man keeps his word." Cordelia would hear it said by Silas and by Callum and by Declan, and eventually even by Mrs. Kessler in her own gentle voice, perhaps 200 times before the year was out. It became the banner under which that family walked. It became, in a way, the first gift that Cordelia Pennington had given to the Ashford brothers, though she did not realize at the time that she had given it. A few nights later, Declan brought his mandolin down from where it hung on the wall of his bedroom. It was an old instrument with a bowl back of alternating maple and rosewood staves and a spruce top gone honey amber with age. It had belonged to Roisin Fitzgerald. It had come off the ship from Ireland with her in 1856. Declan had been learning to play it since he was 12, and he played it now as his mother had played it in the old modal tunings of the west of Ireland, with a style that was closer to weeping than to music. He sat in the corner by the fire and he played a tune called The Parting Glass. Cordelia had never heard it before. It was a song of farewell the melody carried on a single slow line that rose and fell, like a man's voice trying not to break. When he finished, Mrs. Kessler was wiping her eyes with her apron, and Silas was staring into the flames with a stillness that Cordelia had learned to recognize as the mask he put on when he did not wish his face to be read. "What is the song called, Declan?" Cordelia asked. "The Parting Glass," he said. "My mother used to sing it to us when she was happy and again when she was sad. The Irish sing it at funerals and at weddings both. It is for any moment when a person is leaving a place and knows that they will not come back. It is a beautiful song. There was a town not far from here," he said, "when I was a boy. My mother took me there with her once a month when I was very small to the market. The boys in that town, they knew I was her son. They knew who my mother was and what she was and what the people called her. They caught me by the coat one day when I was perhaps 7 years old, and they called me an Irish bastard, and they called her an Irish witch, and they told me my father should have put both of us back on the ship we came off of." Callum, sitting at the table cleaning a pistol, went very still. "I went home and told my father." Declan said, his hand still resting on the mandolin. "My father saddled his horse. He rode into that town. He did not take a gun. He took a hickory walking stick. And he went to the fathers of those boys one by one, and he had a conversation with each of them that none of them ever spoke of afterward. But in the following week, each of those boys came to our door, and each of them offered me his hand, and each of them said he had been wrong. My father sat on the porch and watched them do it." Silas, still staring at the fire, said, "I remember that. I had forgotten it, but I remember it." "I have never forgotten it," Declan said. "It was the first time I understood that my father loved me. It was also the first time I understood that the world did not." Cordelia reached out without thinking and put her hand over Declan's hand where it rested on the curve of the old mandolin. "You are not what they called you," she said. "Not a single part of you. You are a whole and good man, and your mother would be proud of what you have become." Declan did not lift his face, but a single tear slid down his cheek into his beard, and he nodded once, and he said very quietly, "Thank you, sister." That was the night he began calling her sister. It was what he called her for the rest of her life. The man came in the third week of November. He came in a black sleigh drawn by 2 enormous black horses with 5 outriders around him, and a 6th man dressed in the careful black wool of an Eastern lawyer perched on the seat beside him with a calfskin portfolio in his lap. Cordelia was in the kitchen with Mrs. Kessler working on her second pie crust of the afternoon when she heard the bells of the sleigh harness in the yard. She went to the window. Callum came out of the horse barn at a run, wiping his hands on a rag. Silas came out of the house with his coat half buttoned and his rifle in his left hand, not raised but not fully lowered either. Declan appeared around the corner of the smokehouse with that long, loose stride of his and went to stand at his eldest brother's right shoulder. The man in the sleigh stepped down. He was perhaps 60 years old, running heavy through the middle with a heavy beaver skin coat and a gold watch chain across his broad waistcoat, and small cold eyes set in a face the color of wet clay. He smiled as he walked toward the three brothers, and the smile did not touch his eyes at all. His name was Ezekiel Grimshaw. Cordelia knew this, though she had never before laid eyes on him, because Callum had spoken his name at supper the night before in a tone she had not forgotten. She took off her apron, she went to the front door. She stood on the porch behind Silas's left shoulder, her hands clasped in front of her, and she waited. "Silas Ashford," Grimshaw said, still smiling. "It has been too long. Not since your father's funeral, I believe. I trust the winter is finding you well." "Mr. Grimshaw." Silas's voice was perfectly flat. "State your business." "My business," Grimshaw chuckled. "Straight to the point. So much like old Jeremiah. I have come to make you an offer, Silas. A very generous one. My associate here, Mr. Thorne, has the papers drawn up already. I would like to purchase Silverthorne Ranch, the full 3,000 acres. I am prepared to offer $20,000 cash on signature." Cordelia did the arithmetic in her head. Silverthorne Ranch, with its cattle and its horses and its standing timber and its spring-fed water, was worth at a conservative estimate $80,000. Grimshaw was offering a quarter of its value. "No," Silas said. "Now, Silas, consider it. The winter will be a long one. Feed is expensive. One hard season could ruin you. $20,000 free and clear, and you and your brothers could start over in California or Oregon or wherever you pleased, with a nice stake in hand." "No," Grimshaw's smile widened. He turned his face deliberately and slowly to look at Cordelia. "And who is this lovely creature?" he said. "I had heard, Silas, that you had brought a wife out from the East. I must say she is even more charming than the rumor suggested." He stepped forward. He came up the porch steps without being invited. He stopped in front of Cordelia, and he reached out with one gloved hand, and he took her chin between his thumb and a forefinger and tilted her face up toward his as one might inspect a horse. "My dear," he said, looking down into her eyes, "how does a young woman of your obvious refinement end up in a wilderness like this one with three rough bears for company? I have a house in San Francisco, silk dresses, servants, a balcony that overlooks the bay. A woman of your quality should not be splitting kindling for a roof of Montana pine." Cordelia did not speak. She did not move. She looked steadily up into the man's cold little eyes, and she said absolutely nothing. There was a soft metallic click behind her. Callum Ashford had drawn his pistol and cocked the hammer. He had done it in perfect silence, and he held the pistol low at his right hip, not aimed, but ready. "Grimshaw," Callum said. His voice was gentle. It was that particular gentleness that Cordelia had begun to recognize as the most dangerous sound her middle brother-in-law ever made. "Take your hand off her face, or I will relieve you of the hand entirely. Your choice, sir." Grimshaw laughed, but his hand dropped from her chin. "Fiery lad, your brother," he said to Silas. "Always has been. Very well. Keep your ranch, Silas Ashford. Keep your fiery brother. Keep your pretty bride. But mark my words, all of you. Before the spring thaw, Silverthorne will be mine, one way or another." He stepped back down off the porch. He climbed into his sleigh. Mr. Thorne, the lawyer, had not said a single word through the entire exchange. The sleigh wheeled in the yard and the bells jingled merrily, and the 5 outriders fell into formation around it, and in a moment Ezekiel Grimshaw was gone, and only the deep tracks of his runners in the snow remained. Silas stood on the porch for a long time after he had disappeared. The rifle was still in his left hand. His right hand was clenched into a fist so tight that his knuckles stood out white and bloodless in the cold. "Inside," he said finally. "Everyone inside. Now." That night, Cordelia could not sleep. At about 2 in the morning, she went down the back stairs to the kitchen, thinking she would warm a cup of milk at the stove. She found Callum Ashford already there, stripped to the waist, washing a gash in his right forearm from a basin of water on the table. Mrs. Kessler's bottle of whiskey, the one she used for cakes, stood open at his elbow. Callum, she stopped in the doorway. What happened? Two of Grimshaw's outriders circled back, he said without looking up. Got themselves turned around near the horse barn they claimed after dark. Friendly enough in their words. Not so friendly in the butt of a pistol. One of them swung at me when I asked them their business. I took the pistol away from him and convinced him that he had business elsewhere. Let me see. She crossed the kitchen. She took his arm in both of her hands and turned it to the lamp. The cut was clean but deep, running 4 inches along the outside of his forearm. She did not flinch. She had dressed worse wounds than this on her father in his final year. She reached for the whiskey bottle. This will burn, she said. I know it will. She poured the whiskey. He hissed between his teeth but did not flinch. She took a clean linen cloth that Mrs. Kessler kept stacked on the kitchen dresser, and she cleaned the wound, and she folded a fresh piece of linen into a bandage, and she bound his arm with the careful, quick movements she had learned from her mother in her dying and from her father in his. When she was finished, Callum did not pull his arm away. He looked at her across the kitchen table, his storm gray eyes very dark in the lamplight. Cordelia, he said, can I ask you something? Ask. Why did you not flinch when he put his hand on your face when Grimshaw touched you? You did not move. You did not speak. Most women of your kind would have slapped him or wept or fainted. She thought about it for a moment. Because flinching gives him what he came for, she said. A man like that, he comes to a house to see who will flinch. The one who flinches is the one he takes down first. I learned that from watching my Uncle Cornelius in Boston. I was not about to flinch in front of Ezekiel Grimshaw on the porch of your father's house. Callum stared at her. Then he laughed softly, shaking his head. Well, well, he said. Well, well, well. The city woman has claws after all. I told you my name, she said. You may use it. Cordelia. He picked up his shirt from the back of the chair and slid it gingerly over the bandaged arm. Let me ask you another thing. You felt something about him, did you not, when he stood in front of you? Your grandmother's knowing. It was telling you something. She hesitated. She had not meant to speak of it, but Callum was watching her too closely to lie. Yes, she said. I felt it very strongly. Felt what? He has killed someone. Not in a war in cold blood, for money or for land or for both. There is a dark color around him. My grandmother taught me to see it. It was the blackest I have ever seen around a living man. Callum went very still. You saw that, today, on our front porch. I saw that. For a long moment he did not move. Then he stood up. He buttoned his shirt with careful fingers. He looked at her across the lamplight, and what she saw in his face was not the restless danger she had seen on the first day, not the wariness, not the old hostility. It was something far more complicated, something that was almost but not quite fear. Cordelia Pennington, he said quietly, I am going to tell you something now that my brothers and I have not spoken aloud to any living soul in 5 years. Promise me you will not speak of it to Silas until I have spoken to him first. Promise me that. I promise. My father did not die from a fall off his horse, Callum Ashford said. My father was shot in the back from ambush on a clear spring morning in 1878 on the lower road that runs past Black Pine Land. My brothers and I have always suspected who paid for it. We have never been able to prove it. But now, after tonight, after what you just told me about the color around that man, I know for certain. He reached across the table and he took her hand in his bandaged one. His grip was not gentle. You have to be careful now, sister, he said. The storm you felt coming on the day you stepped off that stagecoach. It is not the ice storm that almost killed us. It is not the winter. It is that man. He will come for us before the spring. And if you have the knowing the way Roisin had it, you are going to have to use it. She looked down at his scarred, rough hand wrapped around hers. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the man she had felt at the edge of her mind that first morning at the stagecoach platform, the man with the telescope on the distant ridge whom she had not yet consciously seen but had already somehow known, was watching. "The mountain does not care, Callum," she said softly, repeating something she had heard him mutter to himself in the barn a week before. "But I do. I am here now, and I will help." Callum Ashford smiled a slow, tired, crooked smile. "The mountain does not care," he said. "But I do. You heard me say that, did you? I thought you were not listening." "I was listening." "Good night, sister," he said. "Good night, Callum." She did not sleep for a long time after he had gone up to bed. She sat in the kitchen by the dying fire, and she thought about Jeremiah Ashford shot in the back on a spring morning 5 years before her arrival, and she thought about Ezekiel Grimshaw's cold smile on the porch that afternoon, and she thought about Callum's bandaged arm, and Silas's father's rifle, and Declan's mother's mandolin, and she understood finally why she had been sent to this valley. Her grandmother, Eleanor McGregor, had been right. You will find your home in the storm, child. But home, she understood now, was not something you were given. Home was something you fought for, and the fight had only just begun. The hardest winter Montana had seen in 30 years came down on the Whitefish Valley in the first week of December, and it did not lift its hand until the last week of March. The snow came first in soft, slow layers, and then in harder driving sheets, and then in blizzards that buried the split rail fences to their top rails and required the brothers to dig tunnels through the drifts between the house and the horse barn. The creek froze over thick enough for a loaded wagon to cross. The thermometer on the north wall of the smokehouse broke one morning at 42 degrees below zero, the mercury frozen solid in its glass tube, and Silas did not replace it because, as he said quietly at breakfast, a man who needs to be told that it is cold on a morning like that has already stopped paying attention to his own hands. Cordelia Pennington lived inside that winter for 4 months, and she came out of it a different woman than she had gone in. She learned to feed 800 head of cattle hay in snow up to her hips. She learned to break ice on water troughs with the back of an axe 3 times a day so the stock would not die of thirst in the middle of white abundance. She learned the particular smell of a cow in late pregnancy, and the particular sound a horse makes when its feet are going numb in the frogs, and the particular stillness of a rabbit that is already frozen to death in its own hole. She learned to keep a fire alive for 60 hours in a row during the worst of the February storms, when the wind blew so hard down the chimney that the flames came out sideways and Silas had to hold wet blankets against the hearthstones to keep the whole parlor from filling with smoke. She learned what it felt like to be so tired that her own name stopped meaning anything to her for hours at a time. And she learned in the particular way a woman learns these things to love a man. It happened slowly, as Silas Ashford did everything slowly. It did not happen in one great revelation. It happened in 100 small ones. The way he set his coffee cup down on her side of the table every morning without comment, having noticed that she liked to drink from the east-facing chair. The way he came up the back stairs one night when she was down with a fever, and he stood outside her door and would not come in because it would not have been right, and he called through the wood to ask if she needed anything. And when she said, "No, thank you, Silas, I am all right," he had said, "I will be on the other side of this door until morning then." And he had sat there all night on a hard wooden chair, and she had known he was there, and she had slept better than she had slept in weeks. The way he taught her in early January to skin a deer he had shot, and he had shown her without flinching and without condescension. And when her hands shook at the first cut, he had put his own scarred hand gently over hers to steady the knife. And for 3 seconds she had forgotten entirely about the deer. It happened the way snow accumulates. You do not notice each flake. But one morning you look out the window and the world has become something different than it was before. Callum, for his part, had stopped being her opponent in the middle of December, and he had not gone back to being her opponent since. He became instead her brother. He teased her mercilessly. He called her the city woman long after it had stopped stinging, because by then it was only a joke between them. He let her beat him at checkers one Sunday night, and then grew so incensed at losing that he challenged her to 5 more games in a row, and she beat him 3 of those 5, and he threw his cap on the floor in mock fury, and then laughed until Mrs. Kessler threatened to put them both out in the snow. He rode out with her in the worst of the weather when Silas could not, because cattle still had to be checked, and more than once he pulled her horse out of a drift by the reins when Juniper had floundered to her chest. He saved her life twice that winter, and she would not learn about the second time until many years later, when a hired hand who had seen it told her at a barn raising, long after Callum's hair had gone white at the temples. Declan taught her to read the mountains. He walked her up the East Ridge on a quiet day in late January, when the sky had cleared to a cold, hard blue, and the wind had finally fallen. He showed her the tracks of a wolverine in the snow, and the tracks of a mule deer, and the tracks of a mountain lion. He showed her how to tell a snowshoe hare from a cottontail. He showed her in a stand of lodgepole pine how to find the small gray moss called usnea that his mother had used to pack wounds, and the inner bark of the cottonwood, which could be chewed for pain, and the stout little stalks of arrowleaf balsam root, which would push up through the snow and march with their bright yellow flowers that were a sign that the mountain was waking again. My mother taught me all of this, he said, not in any one lesson, in 1,000 small ones. I was 8, 9, 10 years old. I walked beside her in this country before she died. Everything I know of the green world I know, because she put it into my hands. You remember her very clearly. I remember her the way you remember your grandmother, he said. Some women are that kind of woman. They do not leave a person who loved them. They stay in the rooms of that person's mind forever. Cordelia thought of Eleanor McGregor. She thought of Roisin Fitzgerald. She thought of the long, thin line of women running back through generations, passing on what they knew to the ones who came next, because there was no written book for this, and no school and no teacher other than the one who had gone before. On Christmas Eve, Declan gave her a gift. He had carved it over the course of the winter in the long evenings after supper, when the others thought he was merely whittling. It was a pendant shaped like an oak tree carved from a single piece of pale yellow aspen wood. The roots of the tree curled down into a small round disc, and the branches spread up into a fine lacework of leaves that were no larger than grains of wheat and yet somehow distinct from one another. A slender leather thong ran through a tiny hole at the top of the trunk. The oak, he said, putting it into her palm in front of the great stone fireplace, while Silas and Callum and Mrs. Kessler watched. It is the tree of protection in the old Irish way. The storm singer wears the oak because the oak does not bend to the storm. It stands, and it shelters what stands beneath it. My mother wore a pendant very like this one. It went into her grave with her. I carved this for you, Cordelia, because you belong here now. You are home now. Mrs. Kessler, standing beside Declan with her apron twisted in her hand, said quietly, "Ja, you are home now, Liebchen." And Silas Ashford, sitting on the hearthstone with his pipe unlit in his fingers, looked across the firelight at Cordelia with an expression on his face that she had not seen on the face of any man who had ever looked at her before. And he said nothing at all because Silas was not a man of many words, but she understood what he was not saying, and her own heart turned over in her chest as though it were waking up for the first time in her life. That was Christmas Eve. The fire was December 28th. She woke at 2 in the morning with the knowing screaming behind her eyes. Not a storm this time. Something worse. Fire. The word was a hammer blow inside her skull. She was out of her bed and into the hallway in her nightgown and bare feet before she had fully remembered who she was. "Fire!" she shouted down the hall. "Fire! Fire! Fire! Silas!" She reached his door. She did not knock this time. She threw it open. He was already up. He had already smelled the smoke. He was pulling on his boots with one hand and grabbing his coat off the peg with the other. "Horse barn," he said. "I can smell it. Get Mrs. Kessler out of the house." She turned and ran. She banged on Callum's door. She banged on Declan's door. She took the back stairs 2 at a time and pulled Mrs. Kessler out of the small bedroom off the kitchen where the old woman slept, and she wrapped her in a heavy shawl and led her out onto the back porch. And Mrs. Kessler stood on that porch in her nightcap with her Bible clutched in her hands and prayed in German while the yard filled with running men. The horse barn was on fire. The flames had come up from the hayloft where whoever had set it had piled loose straw and emptied a full can of kerosene before dropping the match. The fire was already eating through the roof by the time Callum got to the main doors. Inside, 45 horses were screaming. Callum went in first. He went in without a coat. He went in with a wet bandana tied across his face and a stock whip in one hand, and he went down the line of stalls, unbolting them one by one. Declan went in behind him with two handheld lanterns that had been smothered with wet rags to keep their flames from catching on the falling embers, and a length of rope looped over his shoulder to lead the panicked horses out by the halter. Silas organized the bucket line. He and four of the hired hands worked the pump handle at the back well, and Cordelia and Mrs. Kessler, in the younger hands, passed buckets of icy water from the well to the burning wall, and for 30 full minutes they could not keep up with the flames, and then for another 30 minutes they held the flames even, and then finally, foot by foot, they began to drive the fire back. A burning cross beam fell from the roof inside the barn. Cordelia saw it fall silhouetted through the open doors. She saw Declan directly beneath it, leading a bay gelding out by the halter. She screamed his name and began to run, though she knew she could not reach him in time. Callum reached him. Callum had been 3 stalls behind his younger brother, and he had seen the beam start to go, and he moved the way a man moves only in those moments when he does not quite consider his own death worth stopping for. He hit Declan from the side with his full weight and his full speed. The two of them went down in a tangle of limbs and horses' legs and falling burning wood, and the cross beam came down exactly where Declan had been standing. And Callum's shoulder went through a wall of embers, and his coat caught fire, and Cordelia watched him stagger upright with flames climbing his back and rolling in the snow of the barnyard. And Silas himself ran in with a wet horse blanket and smothered the fire out of his brother's coat with his own gloved hands. When it was over, when the last of the horses were out and the last of the flames were down, and the ruined, smoking skeleton of the horse barn stood black against the gray dawn, Callum Ashford was lying in the snow of the yard with third-degree burns across the back of his right shoulder and down onto his ribs. And Declan was sitting beside him, holding his uninjured hand, and Silas was on his knees in the snow, with his head bowed, and Cordelia was kneeling beside Callum, cutting away the burned remains of his shirt with a pair of kitchen scissors Mrs. Kessler had pressed into her hand, and she was saying over and over under her breath, "You will not die. Callum Ashford, you will not die. You will not die. You will not die." He did not die. He came very close. The burns took 2 months to heal, and he carried the scars for the rest of his life, but he did not die. And in the small hours of that same morning, while Mrs. Kessler tended Callum by the parlor fire, and Declan stood shaking by the kitchen window, Silas Ashford walked out to the yard alone with a lantern, and he walked the ground around the burned barn in widening circles, and on the third pass, 30 yards back in the tree line, he found what he was looking for. He came back into the kitchen and laid it on the table in front of Cordelia without a word. It was an empty kerosene can, 3-gallon tin, the sort any farmer in the territory would own, but stamped on the bottom in black ink in the careful block lettering of a ranch brand were 2 letters, B.P. Black Pine. Silas did not speak for a long moment. Then he said in a voice of such cold and absolute quiet that Cordelia would remember the sound of it for the rest of her life, "I am going to town in the morning. I am going to send a wire from Kalispell, and when I get back, I am going to find out the rest of what I need to find out. And then, Miss Pennington, you and I are going to have a conversation about what comes next for all of us." He went. He was gone for 2 days. Cordelia cared for Callum through those 2 days, changing his bandages every 4 hours with a mixture of fresh, clean water and a salve that Mrs. Kessler made from mutton tallow and lavender oil and something else that she refused to name. Callum drifted in and out of fever. In one of his clearer moments in the middle of the second night, he caught Cordelia's wrist with his good hand and said, "You saw the color. On the porch, you told me. You saw it." "I saw it. He is going to come for a sister. I know Callum. Do not let him take Silas too. Our father is already in the ground because of that man. Do not let him take Silas. He will not take Silas, she said. I swear it on my grandmother's grave. He will not take Silas. Silas came back from Kalispell at dusk on the third day. He came into the house and he took off his hat and he hung it on the peg by the door and he went to the hearth and he stood in front of the fire warming his hands for a long, quiet moment before he turned around. I went to see Henry Fletcher, he said. Henry Fletcher was an old trapper who had been his father's friend who lived alone in a one-room cabin on the north edge of the Silverthorne property. I have had a suspicion about Henry for a long time. I bought him 3 drinks at the saloon in Kalispell. I asked him in front of witnesses what he knew about the day my father died. He paused. His eyes moved from Cordelia to Declan, standing by the window, to Mrs. Kessler sitting beside Callum's pallet by the fire. Henry was on the road that morning, Silas said. Henry saw a man with a rifle in the trees above the road. Henry watched that man draw down on my father from ambush and shoot him in the back. And Henry watched him then ride up and stage the scene to look like a fall. Henry says he has known the man for 30 years. Henry says the man was Abel Collins. Abel Collins has worked for Ezekiel Grimshaw for 15 years. Abel Collins does not ride out on a winter morning and shoot a neighbor in the back on his own initiative. Nobody spoke for a long time. Henry has kept this for 5 years because he is an old, frightened man, Silas said. He has kept it because Abel Collins told him at the saloon 2 weeks after the shooting that if he ever breathed a word of what he had seen, his cabin would burn with him in it. Henry told me tonight because he has come to understand that it is going to happen anyway. Grimshaw will kill him now whether he speaks or keeps his silence. So he told me to at least do one right thing before the end. Silas, Cordelia said, there is something else, something I have not told you yet. Callum and I spoke of it the night Grimshaw came. Callum gave me his word he would speak to you first, but Callum has been fevered. Silas looked at her steadily across the room. Tell me. I felt it in that man the afternoon he stood on our porch. I felt the murder in him. I felt your father's death on him. I knew it before Henry Fletcher spoke a word to you at any saloon. I knew it, and Callum knew that I knew. Silas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something in them that she had never seen there before. It was not grief. It was not rage. It was something older and slower and deeper than either of those. All right, he said softly. All right then. We will do this now and we will do it right and we will not do it out of fury. A man keeps his word. I gave mine to my father. I am going to keep it. There was a plan. Cordelia proposed it that night after the house had quieted and Callum had been dosed with a measured amount of the whiskey Mrs. Kessler kept in the cake cupboard and was sleeping at last without fever dreams. She proposed it standing in front of the great stone fireplace with the oak pendant that Declan had carved for her, heavy at her throat, and she proposed it with her voice steady and her hands perfectly still. She would ride alone the 15 miles to the main house of the Black Pine Ranch. She would present herself to Ezekiel Grimshaw as a woman who had had enough of mountain winters and 3 rough brothers and the hard silence of Silas Ashford. She would ask for his protection. She would ask for a ride back east. She would stay the night under his roof because the ride to Kalispell could not be made the same day. And she would, in the hours she spent drinking brandy with him in his parlor, draw out of him the confession that neither Henry Fletcher's frightened word nor her own knowing could alone put in front of a federal marshal. Silas said in the first instant, absolutely not. He said it flatly. He said it without room for argument. No, he said. Out of the question, Cordelia. I would sooner ride to hell myself than send you into that man's house alone. No. Silas, she said, listen to me. I am listening, and I am saying no. Silas Ashford, she said, and her voice had gone very quiet. I did not come to this valley to be protected. I came to be a partner in the life you were building here. If you will not let me help, if you will not trust me to do a thing I know I can do and which no one else in this house can do, then we have no life together, you and I, because that is not what a marriage is. That is what a cage is. I will not live in a cage, not for any man on earth, not even for you. He stared at her. Declan, standing silently by the window, stared at them both. I have the knowing Silas, she said. He does not know I have it. He looks at me and sees a pretty ornament that he put his hand on without permission. That is my armor. He will think he is toying with me, and I will be reading him like a book the entire time. I will know the instant it turns, and I will get out before it does. This is the only card we have. If we do not play it, Henry Fletcher will die before he can testify, and Grimshaw will burn this ranch to the ground by April, and your father will have died for nothing. Silas was silent. Callum, from his pallet by the fire, said hoarsely without opening his eyes, "She is right, brother. Let her go. Declan and I will be within 100 yards of her the whole time. She will not be alone." Declan said 300 yards back in the tree line with 2 rifles and a horn. At the first note of that horn, we come through the front door of that house. I swear this on my mother, Silas. Silas closed his eyes. He was silent for a long time. Then he crossed the room to Cordelia. He stopped in front of her. He lifted one of his scarred, calloused hands, and he laid it against the side of her face, and he looked down at her with an expression she would never afterward be able to describe in words, because the English language had not been built to hold the whole weight of what was in his eyes at that moment. And then very slowly, as a man steps into a river he knows to be too cold for him, Silas Ashford leaned down and he kissed her. It was the first time any man had kissed her truly on the mouth. He was gentle. His beard was rough against her skin, but his lips were warm and careful, and he tasted of pipe smoke and strong coffee and some clean, windblown cleanness that she would associate forever afterward with him and with him alone. The kiss was not long, but when it ended, Cordelia Pennington had to put one hand flat against his chest to keep herself upright, and Silas was not breathing quite evenly, and the fire in the hearth crackled once sharply in the silence. "Do not go," he whispered. "I have to," she whispered back. "Then come back to me. Cordelia, whatever else you do in this life, come back to me." "I will, Silas. I promise I will come back to you." She rode out the next morning at dawn. She rode to Black Pine in a borrowed coat and with a small carpet bag, and with tears streaked deliberately down her cheeks from half an hour of standing in the cold yard thinking of her grandmother's last day. She rode in on a winded horse, and she half fell from the saddle into the hands of the men at Grimshaw's door, and she said she had run away. She had run away. She could not stand those men. She could not stand that winter. Please, please, please. She needed help. Ezekiel Grimshaw received her in his parlor. He poured her brandy. He sat her close to his fire. He was delighted with himself. He was a man who had spent his whole life believing that every woman could be bought with the right combination of silk and terror, and here was the proof of his philosophy come walking, weeping through his front door in the middle of winter. He was for those 3 hours almost giddy with his own triumph, and he talked. He talked about his rise. He talked about his holdings. He talked with the warm, careless expansiveness of a man who has drunk 3 brandies in front of what he believes to be a trembling and terrified pretty woman about his enemies past and present. "Your old neighbor," he said, smiling. "That stiff-necked old Welshman, Jeremiah Ashford. Do you know, my dear, he stood in this very parlor once and told me I would never own a single acre of his valley. Well, 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 I had a man of mine ride out on a fine spring morning in '78, a fellow named Collins, good with a rifle, very good. He put one in old Jeremiah's back from about 200 yards, made it look like a fall. I had a drink that night, my dear. I had more than one." Cordelia, sitting across the firelight in Grimshaw's own leather armchair, the little carved oak pendant from Declan tucked out of sight beneath the collar of her dress, smiled softly and said, "How clever of you, Mr. Grimshaw. And nobody ever knew." "Nobody ever will," he said, laughing. "Those 3 Ashford bears. They suspect. Of course they suspect. But suspicion is not proof, and in this country without proof, a man can live as long as he likes." He drank. She smiled. He talked on. He told her about the fire at the horse barn, which he said his man had set. He told her about 3 other men he had had killed over the years. He told her the name of the crooked sheriff at Kalispell who was on his payroll. He talked for an hour, and he talked for another hour, and at some point, somewhere in the middle of the third hour, something changed behind his eyes. He set his brandy glass down. He looked at her in a new way. "My dear," he said quietly, "you are a very good listener, are you not? Almost too good. For a young lady who has just had a very upsetting ride through the snow, you seem remarkably composed. You have not asked me a single question about your passage east. You have asked me a great many questions about my own affairs." Cordelia's knowing, which had been a low, steady hum behind her eyes all afternoon, spiked suddenly into a white-hot alarm. She did not move. She smiled. She picked up her own brandy glass with a hand that did not shake. "Mr. Grimshaw," she said, "you are a fascinating son. A woman enjoys the conversation of a fascinating man." He stood up. He was still smiling, but it was a different smile. "I believe," he said, "that I will keep you here with me for a while, my dear. Permanently, perhaps?" "Yes. Yes, I think I would like that very much. I do not believe you are going anywhere east after all." Cordelia set the brandy glass down. She reached into the pocket of her dress. Her fingers found the small brass hunting horn that Declan had given her that morning. She closed her hand around it. She screamed once, clear and sharp, and she put the horn to her lips and blew the single hard ringing note that meant, "Come now." The front doors of the house slammed open. Callum Ashford came through them with his pistol drawn, Declan 2 steps behind him with a long rifle at his shoulder. The butler caught a pistol butt across his jaw before he had time to raise his own weapon and went down in a heap against the wall. Abel Collins, who had been standing in the hallway outside the parlor, managed to get off one shot that went wide of Callum's head before Callum shot him cleanly through the chest. 2 more of Grimshaw's men came down the stairs at a run. Callum shot the first cleanly. Declan's rifle came up, and he wounded the second in the shoulder, disarming him without taking his life. Grimshaw lunged for Cordelia. She had already stepped back. She had already pulled her grandmother's small, pearl-handled revolver out of the other pocket of her dress where Silas had made her put it before she rode out that morning. She pointed it at Grimshaw's chest with both hands, the way Callum had taught her, and she did not close her eyes, and she did not flinch. "Stop," she said. He stopped. Declan in the doorway was bleeding from a graze across his right thigh that neither he nor she nor anyone else would notice for another 10 minutes. "United States Marshal Tobias Bridger of the Helena office," said a new voice from the hallway, as a tall man in a long dark coat stepped into the parlor behind Callum with a badge on his chest and a rifle in his hands and 2 deputies at his back. "Arrived on the afternoon train at Kalispell 2 days ago in response to a telegram sent by Mr. Silas Ashford. Mr. Grimshaw, you are under arrest for the murder of Jeremiah Ashford, the attempted murder of Miss Cordelia Pennington, and arson in the first degree. Put your hands on your head." They rode home to Silverthorne on a bright, cold morning in the first week of January 1884. Declan's leg had been bandaged. Cordelia's pocket was full of a dozen pages of careful written notes she had taken unseen on a small pad of paper hidden under her shawl through the whole of Grimshaw's confession. The marshal's men had Grimshaw in irons in a wagon behind them. Henry Fletcher was coming down out of his cabin that afternoon to add his own statement. They rode through a dawn of such still, cold beauty that Cordelia could not speak. The sun came up red over the eastern peaks, and the snow across the Silverthorne Valley turned rose-colored and then gold. Silas was waiting in the yard of the main house when they came over the last rise. He was waiting alone without his coat in the bitter air because Mrs. Kessler would tell Cordelia later he had not been able to stay indoors since she had ridden out at dawn the morning before. He had stood in that yard for nearly 24 hours watching the road. Cordelia slid from the saddle and ran to him. He caught her. He caught her against his chest with both arms, and he pressed his face into her hair, and he did not try to hide the shaking of his shoulders, and she did not try to hide the weeping of her own. "You came back to me," he whispered. "I came back to you," she said. Cordelia Pennington, Silas Ashford said into her hair, into the cold rose-colored morning, into the silence of the Whitefish Valley and the whole rest of their lives to come. Will you marry me? Not in 6 months. Now, as soon as a preacher can be brought to this house. Will you marry me? Yes, she said. Yes, Silas, yes. And Reverend Obadiah Callahan was in fact brought out from Kalispell on the very next Sunday, and on a bright cold morning in the second week of January 1884, with the deep winter snow lying bright and untouched on the rise behind the house where Jeremiah Ashford and Margaret O'Brien and Roisin Fitzgerald lay, Cordelia Pennington became Cordelia Ashford in the front room of the main house with Callum as best man, and Declan playing his mother's mandolin from the corner, and Mrs. Agnes Kessler weeping openly in her chair, and Silas Ashford, who was not a man of many words, turned to her at the end of the vows and said only, "My wife." And Cordelia, who understood at last what her grandmother had meant, said back with all her heart, "My husband." The door to the master bedroom where Jeremiah Ashford and 2 wives had slept before her closed softly behind them that evening. Outside, the deep January snow glittered under a hunter's moon, and the stars over the Whitefish Range burned cold and clean and close enough to touch. And by the time the sun rose the next morning over the valley that was now at last truly her home, everything between Cordelia and Silas Ashford had been made whole forever. The spring that came to the Whitefish Valley that year was the sweetest any of them could remember. The snow melted off the south-facing slopes in the last week of March. The creek broke its ice in the first week of April. The arrowleaf balsam root pushed up through the wet ground and opened its yellow faces to the sun by the middle of that same month. And Cordelia Ashford walked out one bright morning with her husband and stood among those flowers, and she looked up at him and she smiled, and he smiled back at her, and she thought, "We have done it. We have survived it. And now we begin." Ezekiel Grimshaw was tried in federal court in Helena in the month of May. Henry Fletcher gave his testimony without flinching. Cordelia gave hers. The notes she had taken were entered into the record. The jury was out for 40 minutes. Grimshaw was hanged on the first morning of June 1884, and his great ranch was broken up and sold off in pieces by federal decree, and most of the best of it was bought at fair price by the Ashford brothers, and Silverthorne grew that summer by another 2,000 acres. Callum healed. The scars across his shoulder and ribs stayed with him, as Cordelia had said they would, but the strength came back, and by the time the summer roundup began, he was riding again. He met Prudence Hawthorne at a 4th of July picnic in Kalispell. That same year, a sharp-tongued young woman with copper-colored hair, who was the daughter of the man who owned the Kalispell Hotel. Callum courted her all through that autumn. They were married in the front room of Silverthorne in the month of April, 1885, by the same Reverend Callahan who had married Silas and Cordelia the year before, and Prudence moved into a small house on the north edge of the ranch that Callum and 2 of the hired hands built with their own hands in the weeks before the wedding. Declan took longer. Declan always took longer. It was not until the summer of 1887 at a schoolhouse raising in Kalispell that he stood on a ladder hammering cedar shingles and looked down and saw a young woman named Beatrice Whitmore walking across the yard with a basket of sandwiches for the workers, and something inside him stopped and paid attention. Beatrice was 24 years old, a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who had come west to work at the territorial school because she had grown tired of a life in the East in which she was expected to agree with everyone and marry a man she did not love. She had copper skin and dark hair and a direct, level gaze. And when Declan came down the ladder and introduced himself and said very quietly that he was a quiet man, but a patient one, she had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Quiet men are the only kind I have ever trusted." They married in the summer of 1888. Beatrice did not care that his mother had been called the Irish witch. Beatrice thought, as she told Cordelia once in the kitchen over bread dough, that every woman worth knowing had been called something ugly by someone. They built their own house on the eastern edge of Silverthorne, within sight of Callum and Prudence's, and Declan kept carving, and Beatrice kept teaching, And the evenings at the main house when all three brothers and their wives and Mrs. Kessler sat around the long table for supper became the happiest evenings Cordelia had ever known. Her first child was a son born in the spring of 1885. They named him Jeremiah after his grandfather. Silas held the boy in his scarred hands the first night, and he wept, and he did not try to hide it from his wife. And Cordelia thought a man who can weep openly at the joy of his child is a man I will love until the end of my life. 2 years later came a daughter. They named her Eleanor after Cordelia's grandmother. She had her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's storm gray eyes, and she had the knowing. Cordelia saw it in the child before she was 3 years old, the way the little girl would lift her head to watch a sky that her parents could not read, and the way she would wake in the night before a thunderhead arrived. A third child, another son, came in 1890. Ronan, they named him after a man in an old Irish story that Declan knew. He grew up quiet like his uncle, and fierce like his Uncle Callum, and steady like his father, and brilliant in a way that belonged only to himself. The ranch grew. The weather station Cordelia built in 1890 with Declan's patient help became a record that was consulted first by the neighbors, then by the territorial government, and eventually, after Montana became a state in 1889, by the United States Department of Agriculture itself. Her predictions over the course of 40 years were correct often enough that agricultural historians would later write books about her. She herself never thought of the knowing as anything other than what her grandmother had called it, a thing inherited, a thing owed forward, a thing to be used for the good of the people around her and never for anything else. The years turned. The 1890s brought prosperity, and the 1900s brought grandchildren, and the Great War of 1914 brought the first hard sorrow of the family's adulthood when Callum's eldest son Ewan was killed at Belleau Wood in the summer of 1918. Callum never fully recovered from that loss. Prudence bore it better in the way of women. Cordelia sat with her sister-in-law in the dark of the barn for a whole night after the telegram came, and she held her, and she did not try to give comfort with words, and she thought, this is what my grandmother meant. This is also part of the knowing, to sit with another woman in the dark and to hold her and to say nothing. Mrs. Agnes Kessler died in the autumn of 1918 at the age of 95 in her own small bedroom off the kitchen of the main house. Cordelia was with her at the end. The old German woman opened her eyes one last time and said in the clear, clean accent of her Bavarian girlhood, "You came home, Liebchen. You came home." And then she closed her eyes and she was gone. They buried her on the rise behind the house next to Jeremiah and Margaret and Roisin. Declan played the parting glass on his mother's mandolin. It was the only song that was right. The three Ashford brothers sat on the porch of the main house that night, the three of them alone, with a bottle of Callum's good whiskey between them. Silas was 73 that year. His hair had gone fully white. He walked now with a cane because of an old injury from a horse fall in 1905 that had never fully healed. Callum was 70, gray-streaked and lean. Declan was 60, his beard shot through with silver, his hands gone a little stiff with carving. But they were still the three brothers. They were still unmistakably the sons of Jeremiah Ashford. "We did it," Callum said, looking out over the valley in the gathering blue dusk. "Father would be proud." "Not just proud," Declan said quietly. "Both the mothers would be too." Silas drank. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I made one mistake in all of this. I made many, but I made one that matters. I almost did not write the advertisement. I almost did not send for her." "But you did," Callum said. "I did. And every good thing in my life came from that one letter." He looked into his glass. "She saved us brothers, everything we have. We owe it all to her." "Not all," Declan said. "She will tell you that. Some of it we built. But yes, without her, none of it holds together." They drank to Cordelia on the porch in the dark, and somewhere in the kitchen they could hear her laughing at something Prudence had said, and the sound of her laughter came out through the open window and over them like a warmth. Silas died in the autumn of 1925 at the age of 80 in his own bed in the master bedroom of the main house. It was his heart, the doctor said. He had known it was coming for some weeks. He had set his affairs in order. He had spoken to all three of his children. He had sat on the porch one last time with his brothers, and he had laughed, and he had held his oldest grandson on his knee. On his last night, he asked Cordelia to leave the oil lamp burning low on the dresser. She did. She lay down beside him in the bed they had shared for 41 years, and she held his hand and she listened to him breathe. "Darling," he whispered at one point very late. "Yes, winter always ends. Remember that." "I will remember. I will be on the other side waiting for you. I sat outside your door one night once when you had a fever. Do you remember?" "I remember." "I will sit outside this door too, until you come through." She could not answer. She only nodded against his shoulder. He was gone by morning. On the small writing desk in the corner of the bedroom, he had left a letter. It was folded in half. Her name was on the front in his careful, steady handwriting. "Cordelia," it said when she unfolded it. "If you are reading this, I have gone before you, and I am sorry for that. I know we always thought we would go together, but the heart chooses its own day, and mine has chosen mine. 42 years ago, I wrote an advertisement in a newspaper because I needed a wife who would not flinch. I did not write it looking for love. I did not believe in love. I thought that part of me had been buried with my mother in 1855, and I did not expect to dig it up again." You dug it up. You did it without trying to. You did it by stepping off a stagecoach in Kalispell on a cold October afternoon and telling me that a storm was coming and being right, and then doing it again and again every season of our lives together for 41 years. You did it by being the woman you are. I have tried my whole life with you to be the man you deserved. I know I fell short in 100 ways. You know all of them. You forgave all of them. That is the greatest of the many gifts you gave me. Our children are good people. Our grandchildren are good people. The ranch is in strong hands. None of that is because of me. All of it is because of you. Do not be sad for too long, darling. Winter always ends. Spring will come as it always does. And when your own day comes, I will be on the other side of the door, waiting as I promised. Silas. Cordelia read the letter once. She folded it. She put it in the drawer of the writing desk with her mother's cameo brooch and her grandmother's small pearl-handled revolver and the little carved aspen deer Declan had given her 42 years before. She went downstairs. She told Mrs. Agnes Kessler's grandniece, who was now the housekeeper, that Silas was gone. She sent for her sons and her daughter and her brothers-in-law in the ranch hands. She did not weep until 3 days after the funeral, when she was alone in the garden she had planted in 1884, and she saw a single cardinal sitting on the fence post Silas had hammered in with his own hands the spring they had married. Then she sat down in the dirt and she wept, and Prudence, who had been watching from the kitchen window, did not come out to her. Prudence understood. Prudence had been in that same garden after Ewan died. Callum died 2 years later in 1927 in his sleep. He had become gentle in his old age, Cordelia often thought. The restless danger of his younger years had worn away and left behind a kind, funny, gray-haired old man who told the same 3 stories at every supper and who loved his grandchildren beyond reason. Prudence outlived him by 11 years. Declan was the last of the brothers. He would live until 1936. He spent the last decade of his life carving. The small barn beside the main house became a workshop full of the deer and the elk, and the wolves and the bears, and the women with long hair that he made out of aspen and cedar and pine. The best of them now sit in museums in Helena and Bozeman. The rest sit on the mantles of his descendants. He outlived Beatrice by 4 years, and he went quietly with his mother's mandolin on the wall above his bed. And in the spring of 1928, 3 years after Silas had left her, Cordelia Ashford sat on the porch of the main house of Silverthorne Ranch with her great-granddaughter, a 4-year-old girl who had been named Cordelia Grace Ashford after her, and who had the honey blonde hair of her great-grandmother and the storm-gray eyes of her great-grandfather, and perhaps, though it was too early to tell a small piece of the knowing. The little girl was sitting on Cordelia's lap. Cordelia was wrapped in a heavy shawl because the April air was still cool in the evenings. The sun was setting behind the Whitefish Range in the same way it had always set rose and gold and long, deep blue. "Granny," the child said, "tell me the story again." "Which story, my darling?" The one about the stagecoach." Cordelia smiled. She had told this story many times to this child and to her many brothers and sisters and cousins. She would tell it again as many times as the children would ask. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a young woman who lived in Boston where the streets were paved with cobblestones and where she had never once seen a real mountain. She was 23 years old, and she had nothing in the world except a letter from a man in Montana and a grandmother in heaven who had taught her how to listen to the sky." The grandmother with the knowing. The grandmother with the knowing. That is right. And the young woman got on a train and she rode across the country for 6 days, and then she got on a stagecoach and she rode for 2 more. And when she stepped off that stagecoach onto a wooden platform in a little town called Kalispell, she expected to find one man waiting for her, a man named Silas. But there were three. But there were three? Three big bearded mountain men with rifles on their backs. And the young woman was afraid, but she did not run, because the Penningtons, my darling, do not run. And because something in the sky that afternoon was whispering to her that a great storm was coming, and that this was the very reason she had been sent. And she saved the cattle. She saved the cattle, and she saved the ranch. And in the saving, she found herself saved too. She found a man who would wait for her. She found 2 brothers who would defend her. She found a grandmother of the house named Mrs. Kessler who would love her like a daughter. And she found that the storm her own grandmother had promised her, the storm she would find her home in, was not the ice storm at all, or the fire, or the winter, or the bad man who came to take the ranch. It was something much bigger than any of those things. It was her whole new life. "Granny," the child said after a moment, "are you going to find Granddaddy in the storm too?" Cordelia looked out across the valley. The last of the sun was touching the highest peaks of the Whitefish Range, and the shadows were growing long across the grass, and somewhere on the ridge above the house, a great golden eagle was riding the evening thermals. She felt, as she had felt many times in these last 3 years, the old quiet warmth of her husband beside her. He had never really left her. She did not think he ever would. "Yes, darling," she said softly, kissing the top of the child's honey blonde head. "Yes, when my time comes, I will find him. He is waiting on the other side of the door. He promised he would be." The little girl leaned her head against Cordelia's chest. They sat together on the porch for a long while, watching the sun go down, saying nothing at all. Cordelia Ashford lived another 6 years after that April evening. She died in her own bed in the same master bedroom where Silas had died before her in the spring of 1934, at the age of 74. Her daughter Eleanor held her hand at the end, and her youngest son Ronan sat by the window, and Declan, who outlived her by 2 years, played the parting glass one last time on his mother's old mandolin from the chair by the foot of the bed. Her last words, according to Eleanor, were very soft, and they sounded almost like a question. "Spring, grandmother. Spring has come." They buried her on the rise behind the main house beside Silas, beside his father, Jeremiah Ashford, beside both of his mothers, Margaret O'Brien and Roisin Fitzgerald, beside Agnes Kessler and Callum Ashford, who had gone ahead. Her headstone was simple. It said only her name and the dates, and beneath them in smaller letters, a single line that had been her husband's last written words to her. "Winter always ends." And the Silverthorne Ranch, which she and Silas and his brothers had built with their own hands out of wind and wolves, in a single advertisement in a Boston newspaper, went on and on and on, down through the generations of their children and their children's children, into the country they called Montana, into the long quiet century that followed.